friends, boom, bada boom. The walls were shaking for Russians. More than 200 drones attacked Russia. A military airfield in Engels was attacked. Strategic bombers that attack Ukraine were damaged, as well as depots with FABs, KABs, and cruise missiles. Moreover, it is reported that Kh-555 and Kh-101 missiles for the Tu-95 and Tu-160 were damaged. In Kuban, Russia, the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station has been burning for almost 2 days after a drone attack. The JOR successfully attacked Russian targets in temporarily occupied Crimea. Air defense systems, sea vessels, and a helicopter were hit. 13 Russian radar stations were hit. And in Russia, they claim that the armed forces of Ukraine attempted to break through into the Belgorod region. What is known about this? We will discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I wish everyone good health.
Dear audience, please like this video. Write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments. Roman Grigorievich, how many bombers were damaged? Because according to the information I have, there were several bombers there and one Il, which delivered the missiles. They write that in the morning, an Il-76 arrived at the base, likely delivering a new batch of Kh-101 missiles, and there were 3 Tu-95MS and 2 Tu-160S at Engels. What do you think?
Well, they were definitely damaged. The question is to what extent, because there was a large-scale attack, and the attack was carried out by drones, most likely with a missile under the Bada Boom scheme. Since it's Bada Boom, then the fifth element that broke through the roof, if anyone remembers that movie, was most likely one of our missiles. I don't even rule out the possibility that a long-range Neptune was used in this direction. Naturally, the detonation that occurred after the strike and the detonation of missiles, aerial bombs, and small arms ammunition, this small arms ammo that is loaded into aircraft, among other things. Of course, the planes parked nearby couldn't have avoided being damaged. The question is, to what extent were they damaged? I think that within a few days, our intelligence, our general staff will confirm it after analyzing satellite images and decoding them, that is, using objective monitoring tools. And then we'll have another reason to celebrate. Maybe in the next stream, we'll be able to confirm it clearly with you.
Roman Grigorievich, so what could have been hit? So the bombers themselves, the warehouse with cruise missiles, and the aviation fuel depot. So these were the targets of the armed forces of Ukraine, our missiles and our drones?
Any strategic bomber base is, just to give you an idea, like a large city. In addition to the airfield itself, a huge number of infrastructure facilities of various types are involved to support it, ranging from underground fuel storage tanks holding tens of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene to various warehouses, including those for munitions. Especially important is the specialized engineering service for missile preparation, as well as, of course, the storage facilities for aviation bombs and missiles used by these strategic bombers. By the way, not many people talk about this, but several dozen kilometers south of Engels, on the left bank of the Volga, there is another facility known as Saratov 63. This is a nuclear storage facility, or more precisely, a storage site for nuclear warheads intended for strategic and tactical aviation. In other words, it houses significant stockpiles belonging to the 12th Main Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, specifically tactical nuclear weapons. Just a few dozen kilometers more, and the mushroom cloud wouldn't be like the one over Engels. It would be a massive one, reaching all the way to Kazakhstan. The Kazakhs would have seen it already. It's a shame, really. I have too many friends in Kazakhstan, so of course I wouldn't want to disappoint them like that. But still, so this is a really serious facility, and to take it out, not just with rockets and drones, to flatten it completely, you'd need several squadrons of bombers carpet bombing the place. But if you blow up this underground fuel storage, and let me repeat, we're talking about tens of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene used by strategic bombers. Just one bomber, like the Tu-160, takes on board the equivalent of 3 railway tank cars of this kerosene. That's over 150 tons of aviation kerosene being loaded at a time. And for the Tu-95, it's one whole tank car. So that's not a small amount either. In other words, there's definitely something worth targeting there. And if a strike were to hit all of this infrastructure, it could be catastrophic for the Russians. By the way, it was to Engels that we once handed over our 2 bombers. Those were the Tu-160s, the Tu-95s, the Tu-22s, our own A-55s. Hundreds of missiles were handed over by Kuchma back then. It was Kuchma who was in charge of all that, at least. And now basically we're going to try to destroy the very same strategic bombers we once handed over to the Russians. As for what exactly was hit, we will know for sure in the next few days once the detailed satellite images have been thoroughly analyzed and processed.
Roman Grigorievich, how many military personnel are usually stationed at such air bases, at military airfields?
Well, the thing is, they perform different tasks and the area involved varies as well. But there should be at least a regiment there, that's for sure. About 1,500 Russian troops should be involved in this process. 1.5 to 2,000.
Could we have eliminated enemy personnel with these strikes, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, definitely, 100%. The thing is, even the SIS, that's the Engineering and Technical Service, a special engineering service. Naturally, there's also the security and defense of the facility itself, where the missiles are stored. Missiles aren't stored like matches after all. There are even certain mechanisms for climate control, especially for missiles of this kind. So there, well, several dozen were definitely destroyed, and the remaining hundreds, well, were definitely emptied out by that strike. Believe me, the shockwave there was serious.
Roman Grigorievich, indeed, right now the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station has been burning for almost a whole day after the drone attack. And everyone is discussing the long-range Neptune as a modified missile. Let's talk about this missile as well as the strikes on oil refineries and depots. Take the Kavkazskaya station, for example, which has been burning for almost 2 days now.
Malyuk and Budanov's sanctions have now become the sanctions of Ukraine's defense forces. Why? Because in such strikes, for example, the strike on Engels, the security service of Ukraine and special operations forces were naturally involved. That is, at the very least, and probably also the Navy, if a Neptune was used there, since a coastal missile system and a launch platform were at least involved. But I think within a day it will become clear. Long, Neptune Long, is the same situation. That is, it is launched from a coastal missile system. Naturally, it's not just anyone involved in this. The main targets for this type of missile are objects that need to be penetrated. For example, a 150-kilogram warhead is not the same as the 20 kilograms on a drone, or 50, or however much they carry. A 150-kilogram warhead can reach and detonate, as we are seeing now, presumably, let's put it that way for now, they presumably blew up a warehouse with missiles and aerial bombs in Engels. Naturally, the very same type of powerful warhead can be effectively used against TUAPs or to successfully breach the critical detonation system there, either well beforehand or at the crucial pumping stations. This is one of our main objectives right now. God forbid it gets stopped. Right now, all these people who are not part of our government are running around with the idea of how to secure Russia's hydrocarbon industry. So God forbid these strikes are stopped like they were last year. If the sanctions from Malyuk and Budanov hadn't been stopped in May last year, there wouldn't be any this year because there would be nothing left to destroy. We would have simply squeezed everything out last year. Now it turns out they're trying to stop these strikes again. The missile is very good. It's our basic Neptune missile, or Long, or Neptune. This is the basic X-35 missile. At one time, it was also produced at our facility. Our engines for this missile are turbojet dual circuit engines. The missile was air-to-ship. That is its main purpose. In other words, it's an anti-ship system, a missile that was later upgraded to be able to strike land targets, equipped with a good engine and additional fuel tanks. Now it can travel more than 500 kilometers, meaning it reached at least as far as Tuaps, which is 500 kilometers away. I think it could have also struck Engels because they managed to breach what is essentially a closed warehouse. Well, these missiles aren't just lying around outside. In other words, it's secured. If it was breached, it most likely means a missile got in, but there is no confirmation yet. For now, we won't confirm it either. This is just a brief analytical note.
Roman Grigorievich, just to clarify for our audience, what is the range of this missile and what new possibilities does this open up for us? Let's make sure we record this now.
Well, the missile's range, at least the confirmed one, is 500 to 600 kilometers, that's for sure. We saw this with Tuaps and perhaps now with Engels as well. It's a little over 600 kilometers to Engels, and that's the actual stated range. So what does 500 or 600 kilometers mean? Well, it's like a semicircle from Moscow through Engels to Tuapse. Just draw this circle. This is everything we can reliably hit with this missile. And if the stated range is 1,000 kilometers, you could put the compass in St. Petersburg, for example, and draw a semicircle that almost reaches the Caucasus. So that would already cover areas closer to Kazakhstan. To the east, it would go beyond the Volga, at least past Engels and Astrakhan, closer to Kazakhstan. And to the south, this missile would reach the North Caucasus if the stated range matches the actual flight range. Technically, this is possible. Basically, the engine is very good. Our engine, which we produce, will definitely run for an hour, and the missile speed is 850 kilometers per hour. So running for an hour or an hour and a half is not a problem. The main thing is the fuel. In other words, however many additional extra buckets of fuel you meticulously put into the missile's propulsion system, that is precisely how far it will ultimately fly.
So could major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, along with military infrastructure targets, potentially be attacked?
Well, definitely, they're already under serious targeting. And in order for us to fully carry out our tasks of securing our border, we need to reach about 2,000 kilometers. Roughly speaking, we need to be able to reach the Urals. It's 2,000 kilometers to the Urals. But a cruise missile, there's hardly any point, for example, in making cruise missiles with such a range right now. Ideally, of course, either drones, which are a bit cheaper, or ballistic missiles. So for this kind of range, either solid fuel or liquid fuel, meaning ballistic missiles. I think we'll resolve this issue, if not this year, then next year.
Roman Grigorievich, there's more good news. The main intelligence directorate successfully attacked Russian targets in temporarily occupied Crimea. Air defense systems came under fire, as well as naval vessels and a helicopter. 13 Russian radar stations were hit, including one L-125 NEOB-SV and the BRL-SMYS. How do you assess the work of the main intelligence directorate? As I understand it, all of this was done over a certain period of time, and it has now been documented.
Well, this definitely took several months. It's the work of the GUR's Magura drones. The main intelligence directorate and the security service have their own drones. Practically all of them are unmanned boats, and both have turned them into aircraft carriers in their own way. Both the GUR's Magura and the SBU's Sea Baby can now essentially function as aircraft carriers. They can carry unmanned aerial vehicles, specifically drones, and they can also carry unmanned surface and underwater vehicles. In other words, they can serve as a kind of mothership and relay station at the same time. So a boat that's several meters long and a certain width can, for example, take unmanned aerial vehicles on board, approach the coast of Crimea or somewhere else, somewhere closer to Russian territory near Novorossiysk, and then from several kilometers off the coast, launch drones under direct control, using the boat itself as a relay station. The guys can carry out a combat mission just like they do directly with, say, those same FPV drones. So a certain type of drone, a UAV, takes off and then destroys Russian radar systems, air defense missile systems, or some other military target, depending on its capabilities. Plus, especially the GUR's Magura drones can also carry air-to-sea missiles. For example, based on the launch system, it's an R-73 air-to-air missile, an excellent missile. It's already half a century old. Thousands of them have been produced, and we have thousands of them. It has a thermal homing head, and if you lock it on, once the missile acquires the target, it will chase it down. And if there are two missiles, Maguras can carry two missiles, then they can also destroy aerial targets. Here's confirmation of a helicopter being destroyed, and that's for sure, and not just one. One was completely destroyed, and the second was seriously damaged. So in this sense, the GUR operatives have practically become naval aviators, I would say. In other words, the GUR has entered a field that isn't typically its own and has performed quite well there. And the security service under Malyuk, that is the GUR led by Budanov and the SPU led by Malyuk, are now using practically the entire range of strike capabilities. And what's more, they're producing them on their own bases, which is very important. These are intelligence agencies operating on their own basis, at their own expense. Their budgets are still quite small. These aren't the armed forces of Ukraine, and they don't have Umarov's billions or hundreds of billions. Yet they've managed to do this on their own, likely found sponsors, and accomplished this kind of task. Well, credit where it's due. They've done a great job. There's nothing more to say.
Roman Grigorievich, before we talk with you about the Belgorod region and the information from Russian war correspondents, I'd like you to give us a brief overview of the Ukrainian missile system Hrom-2. What are its potential capabilities and how should these capabilities be used? Please, the floor is yours.
Well, to understand the process, what is Hrom-2? It's essentially the same as the Iskander. In terms of range, warhead, and control system, we have an Iskander just like this. Several decades ago, a truly good and significant project, specifically named Sapsan, was successfully launched. Based on this foundational Sapsan project, a robust and highly effective solid fuel ballistic missile system was meticulously developed for the Hroms, and quite naturally, this extensive and well-executed project ultimately produced very positive and tangible results. So, work on this project, Hrom-1, and Hrom 2 is ongoing. We achieved a range of 300 kilometers, developed it, and sold it to the Saudis. By the way, with Saudi funding, including selling it along with the technical documentation. But most likely, the intervention of our partners allowed us to at least get the technical documentation back, maybe some launchers, and I wouldn't rule out possibly even some missiles as well. So that's what Hrom 2 is. It's basically the same as the Iskander, 500 kilometers Moscow to Tuapse. That's those 500 kilometers. So if there are enough ballistic missiles, then the people on Rublevka, remember we once talked about this, the Rublevka escorts would be better off staying far away from those bathhouses where the main decisions for further military actions in Russia are made. Why? Because, well, the first strike, the first thunder really ought to bury Lenin. Because honestly, how much longer is he going to lie there after all? The Kremlin is the first target and the second is Rublevka. Or maybe the other way around, depending on preference. Maybe Rublevka will actually be the first to go.
Roman Grigorievich, now, of course, this information has been circulating for several days in Russian propaganda channels and among Russian war correspondents. Because in Russia, they are claiming that the armed forces of Ukraine are attempting to break through into the Belgorod region. What do we know about this? Let's analyze it.
Well, to understand the situation, we have about 600 kilometers of border. If you don't count the curves, just the straight border between Belarus and Oskol, that's between Ukraine and Russia. On our side, that's the Chernihiv, or rather the Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions up to Oskol. On the Russian side, that's the Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod regions. So for us, the main task is to turn this borderline into a front line, because that's the right and smart thing to do. We need to change the architecture of the front to open up the northern front. It was already opened after we started moving towards the Kursk direction, towards Moscow, as some kitchen table idiots call it, under the main objective of tying down enemy forces. Several tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were tied down there. And of course, the creation of the so-called security zone or buffer zone, it can be called differently, a support zone if this is the front line and the minefield strip. We need to create such a security zone, a demilitarized zone about 30 kilometers deep into Russian territory. And the Russians denazify it. They immediately start bombarding it with aerial bombs, artillery, and evacuate the civilian population from there. So such a buffer zone can be created by advancing not even 30 kilometers, but just 3, 5, or 7 kilometers into Russian territory and mining not our land, but Russian territory. If you lay down several 100,000 of these mines, they'll be digging them out for 100 years, if they even bother at all. And naturally, army artillery can add another 25 kilometers, extending the creation of such a buffer zone up to 30 kilometers. In the Kursk direction, we created it, we accomplished this. The only retreat, as we've already mentioned, was practically a catastrophic rout because the decision to withdraw and redeploy to defensive positions was made too late. What we are doing now in the Belgorod region is essentially the same kind of operation, only not as deep, without an operational breakthrough, a tactical operation involving an incursion and the creation of such a buffer zone on Belgorod territory, taking up the best, most advantageous defensive positions. The thing is, there's a difference in elevation there. It's the so-called central Russian upland. The difference in height is about 50 to 70 meters between, just for understanding, between the hills, you know. So the rivers, or rather the small streams that are there, are at an elevation of about 140 meters above sea level, while the tops of these uplands are around 220 or 230. So these elevation differences, it's best to take control of the high ground, no matter where they are, on our side or on the Russian side. If there is an opportunity to enter Russian territory to improve defensive positions, that task is carried out. Right now, in the area of Demidovka, a task is being carried out in the Belgorod direction. Well, the first issue is, of course, creating such a buffer zone. And the second issue is to try to intercept the Russian reserves that will now be freed up from the Kursk direction as we withdraw along the borderline and will be redeployed to the Eastern Front so that they don't end up on the Pokrovsk direction. They have about 2 divisions there, which is practically 30,000 Russian federal troops who could now be redeployed from the Kursk direction to the Eastern Front. They will be passing right by, or rather through the Belgorod region. In order to intercept them, I think that's why such pressure is now being created in the Belgorod area. At least for now, there is positive momentum. Of course, we can't discuss tactical matters, even if we knew them. Well, you can't broadcast tactical information on air. But in reality, I think in a week, we'll talk about the results of this tactical operation.
The Russians have claimed to have allegedly shot down an F-16 over the Sumy region. The Air Force has already debunked this fake. And here's what Andriy Demchenko says. The Russians are storming the Sumy region border on ATVs. The new ISU is destroying their groups. What do you say, Roman Hryhorovich?
Well, they got scared by the information that came out a few days ago. There was some good footage of F-16S being used over Sumy. Naturally, Russian information psychological operations will act differently, but from a logical and tactical standpoint, they responded correctly. Our own CPD and SIPSO people should take a page from their book as well. After all, FSB or KGB officers have been conducting these psychological special operations for 100 years. They had to carry out such an information psychological operation because the appearance of F-16S practically at the line of contact really put pressure on the Russians. Combat missions were carried out at extremely low altitudes, most likely for dropping ordnance. Some types of munitions below the radar horizon of Russian air defenses, so naturally no one could reach them there. And this really hit the Russians in that direction. Naturally, they needed to counter this information. They came up with another information psychological operation, claiming they shot down an F-16 in that direction. Believe me, no one shot anything down. I have friends, a good number of friends, who would have shared the information if anything had actually happened. I can say with confidence, no one shot anything down. The guys are operating along the entire line of contact in F-16S and Mirages. They've already started carrying out their combat missions in those specific directions where it's truly possible, based on the critical density of enemy air defenses and our own inherent ability to effectively cover these valuable aircraft. God's due. All right, first fill in the blanks yourselves so I don't have to swear too much. So, this so-called God's due in Trump's eyes, which was orchestrated by Putin. For what purpose? Well, to create a certain pressure on the Ukrainian. It's the same thing, the same IPSO, an information psychological special operation in which the top officials of the state are involved. This is a serious operation. For what purpose? To give the Russian, mainly the Russian population, and of course Trump, a chance to try to suppress Ukraine, to paint some alternative picture of the real events on the Kursk land. We are holding the Kursk land. No one is encircled there. We are holding it. And the retreat, yes, there was a retreat, indeed, a belated flight. If a month and a half ago, as we said, there had been an organized withdrawal, then it would have been a controlled retreat to defensive lines. It was a flight, but still to defensive lines located on Russian territory. The difference is, well, the Sudzha River in Kursk, the one that runs through the Kursk region, the Pereplyuika River, but its elevation above sea level is 140 meters, while nearby, further south, the elevation is already about 220 meters. So here there is at least a 50 to 70 meter elevation difference, and this is Kursk land. And on these heights, our units that withdrew from the Sudzha direction have taken up positions, and at the moment no one intends to retreat any further. Naturally, the Russians need to show that they are surrounded there, that everything is lost there. The boss is leaving, the cast is coming off, everything is lost, and so on and so forth. They're trying to cut us off, but encirclement is a long way off. It's just unrealistic because this ridge runs along the borderline. And of course, our troops are present on Kursk land. I don't think we're going to leave from there. There's a good defensive line there. And the Russians who are now trying to cut off our direction are stuck in the Basovka area. That is, yes, it's the Sumy region, meaning it's Sumy territory, and it's only a few kilometers from the borderline, nothing more. They're trying to somehow break through to cut off the supply to this group, but in the information space to somehow ramp up the pressure, well, Putin threw out some sweet nothing, so to speak, tossed them to Trump, and now Trump is just mirroring him. What else can he do? Right now, he's tied to Putin, to his non-involvement in that adventure they started together with Netanyahu in the Middle East. Once again, strikes are being carried out against the Houthis, against Gaza, against Lebanon, against Syria. Naturally, if the Russians decide to make their weighty opinion known there, it definitely won't end well for anyone. Most likely strikes against Iran in the Middle East are ahead, and Trump has been dragged into this, and now he has nowhere to go. Well, Witkoff dragged him in. After all, he's such a great Israeli-American or American-Israeli. That's why Russian oil refineries of all kinds will keep burning. Maybe not as intensely as before, but it will continue. And it will be presented a bit differently, not as sanctions or, say, actions by the Ukrainian defense forces, but as the work of various levels of local underground resistance. I think that this kind of work by our informants, by the way, could be just as effective as the Ukrainian defense forces are now. Believe me, tens of millions of Ukrainians will definitely not stop fighting for their land, for their sovereignty, for their territorial integrity. And as for the several million people from Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, you simply won't be able to turn them around.
Dear audience, please like this video. Write a few kind words in the comments to support the armed forces of Ukraine. Share your thoughts about this situation as a whole. The well-known analyst Roman Svitan, Roman Hryhorovich, thank you. And as usual, see you next week.
Goodbye.